Hi everyone, this is Module 3 of Federal and Arizona Constitution, and we're going to be looking at federalism today. And what we need to think about two things. First of all, the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. You need to really focus in on that because that is the roadmap or the process by which we conduct federalism at the constitutional level. It incorporates basically three different entities that I'll be talking about in just a moment, but these entities are sovereign, in other words, independent of each other but dependent on each other at the same time. And again, we need a roadmap to make that make sense. And we also need to take a look at federalism through the eyes of the results of Marbury versus Madison and judicial review. In judicial review, what we created not only with federalism, but we created a way to find our way out of all the problems that would occur no matter what system of government we had chosen. They're the arbiter of disputes between different sovereign entities on any of these three entities, and so they're not only deciding basically who's up and who's down, but how we're going to get through the situation that we find ourselves in over time. Within that, we need to take a look as well about money. Follow the money. In federalism, that is one of the major aspects because we have two ways that the federal government gives money to the state government or to the individual. And when they do this, they can do it by basically two ways, categorically or by block. Categorical grant has real limitations on what you can do with the money, and because of those limitations, they naturally get the role of oversight or authority over the funding that continues beyond just granting it. A block grant, generally very different. Those are by broad categories, generally given to the state, and what we're really talking about is, for instance, money for road infrastructure. And because of the fact that the block grant is so wide in what its conditions are for use, the oversight and the power that comes from that oversight decreases by the same amount. Now, the textbook takes a look at this, and it's a very traditional view of looking at the differences like a cake. The first view of federalism is a layer cake between those three entities, and there is a diagram in your text that you'll see which shows that, but a more complex view is more like a marble cake, and this is what happens when we have cooperative federalism. And that's because the federal government is funding both the state and the individual in different aspects. And so when we have block funding and we have categorical funding in two different levels, we're going to get all kinds of aspects that we can see in terms of the power of money. And if you'd like an example of that, all you have to look at is funding for college education, where you have the states oftentimes funding by block grant and categorical grant, and some of you or your fellow students may have personal assistance that comes from the federal government, and you can see how all those things kind of mix and match, and again, that's elaborated in the textbook. The next thing that we need to look at, and one of the last bits in the chapter, but an important bit, is this idea of an unfunded mandate. Now, this is an interesting way of looking at constitutional power. If the federal government has the ability to mandate things, must it therefore fund those things? And this can be important because if they're passing laws at the federal government that are mandating these things, there can be severe penalties, even laws, if you will, and punishments to individuals. And so then the idea comes up, well, then you'll need to fund that, and you can see the back and forth, which is very interesting reading. The next critical steps in this module: how much variation in the state level policies are we going to be able to tolerate, such as that in the criminal justice system? Currently, we have many states that have the death penalty and some that don't have the death penalty. And so we can look at this in terms of the amount of power which should be granted to the states versus the amount of power which should be granted to the federal government. And when you're doing that, you are definitely looking at federalism. Don't forget to take quiz 3.